Rosalind Mercer slammed her last 11 cents on the counter so hard the coins bounced. "I am not begging," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I am asking for credit. I will pay the rest within the week." Gerald Potts looked at her, really looked at her, up and down, slow and deliberate, the way a man looks at something he's already decided has no value, and then he laughed. "People like you," he said, loud enough for everyone in that store to hear, "always want something for nothing." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. If this story reaches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow this journey all the way to the final word, because what happens next will surprise you. And drop your city name in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. She walked out of that store with her head up. That was the first thing Colton Vance noticed about her. Not her size, not her worn dress, not the empty cloth bag hanging from her shoulder, or the way her hands were shaking, or the fact that she had clearly just been humiliated in front of 5 people who had all chosen to look somewhere else while it happened. He noticed that she walked out with her head up. He had been standing to the side of Potts's store, checking the strap on his saddlebag, when he heard the coins hit the counter. He had heard that sound before the sound of someone spending the last of what they had and knowing it. Then he heard Potts's voice, carrying the way it always did, because Gerald Potts had never once in his life said anything he didn't want the entire room to witness. "People like you always want something for nothing." Colton had gone still. He knew that particular cruelty. He had seen it deployed before the casual, public humiliation of someone who needed something, done in front of witnesses, designed not just to refuse but to diminish. To make the person asking feel that the asking itself was the offense. He had watched through the open door as the woman at the counter picked up her coins without a word. As the other people in the store carefully, deliberately found other things to look at. As she turned and walked toward the door with her spine straight and her jaw set and her eyes aimed at the middle distance the way people aim their eyes when they are fighting with everything they have not to fall apart in public. She came through the door and into the summer light and walked 3 steps onto the wooden sidewalk and stopped. He watched her breathe. In out. Once. Twice her hands, hanging at her sides, curled slowly into fists and then released. Then she stepped down off the sidewalk onto the road and her knees buckled. It lasted only a moment. Maybe 3. She was down. And then she was up again before anyone else had registered what happened, before anyone could come out of the store to see, before anyone riding past on the road could have processed the image fully enough to form an opinion about it. But Colton saw it, and in those 2 or 3 seconds, something clicked into place in his chest that he hadn't expected and couldn't fully name. He crossed the road. "Ma'am," he said. She turned fast the turn of a woman who had learned to know when someone was coming toward her, and to be ready for whatever that meant. Her eyes went to his face and he saw the calculation happening behind them. Threat or not, friendly or not, another person come to make this worse or something else. He stopped a respectful distance away and took his hat off. "I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry about what just happened," he said. "Because that man in there doesn't deserve the dignity of someone apologizing on his behalf." She stared at him. "I'm Colton Vance," he said. "I run a cattle ranch 8 miles north of here, up in the mountains." "I didn't ask," she said. "No. You didn't." A beat of silence. "Rosalind Mercer," she said, because apparently some part of her had decided the introduction should be returned regardless of the circumstances. "Miss Mercer," he said, "when did you last eat a proper meal?" Her eyes went hard immediately. "That is not your business." "No," he said again. "It's not." He reached into the saddlebag on the dark horse standings, patient at the hitching post beside him, and produced a cloth-wrapped package, the kind that came from Mayhale's supply store on the other side of town. The woman who ran the other general store, the one that didn't have Gerald Potts in it. He had been to May's that morning. He held the package out. "Flour, dried meat, beans," he said. "And before you tell me you won't take charity, I'm going to stop you right there." Her mouth, which had already been opening, closed. I need someone who can run a working ranch, he said. Cook, manage supplies, keep financial records straight. The man I had doing it left 2 months ago, and the place is showing it. He kept the package extended, not pushing it toward her, but not withdrawing it either. That's not charity. That's a job offer. And the food is an advance on wages that haven't been agreed to yet. She looked at the package. She looked at him. You don't know a single thing about me, she said. I know you tried to negotiate credit terms with Potts, rather than just asking for handouts, he said. I know when your body gave out on you, just now you were back on your feet in under 3 seconds before anyone could see. And I know you haven't once looked like you're about to cry, even though most people in your situation would have been crying since yesterday. She was very still. What kind of ranch, she said. Cattle, primarily. Some horses. Vegetable garden that's been neglected. About 400 acres in the mountain foothills. How many people work it? Me. 2 ranch hands who handled the stock. Nobody managing the household or the account since my previous arrangement ended. What are the wages? He named a figure. She didn't flinch at it, which told him she knew what fair wages looked like and had already done the comparison. Room and board included, she said. Yes, and if the arrangement doesn't suit me. Then you go, he said, with everything you've earned and no argument. She reached out and took the package, not gratefully, not tearfully. She took it the way a person takes something they have decided is a reasonable transaction with both hands and direct eye contact. I want to see the records before I agree to anything long-term, she said. Whatever you have from the previous arrangement. Fair enough, he said, and I'll need access to whatever supply tallies exist so I can understand the actual state of the operation. Also fair. I'm telling you now, she said, and her voice had gone quiet but extremely clear, the way voices go when someone is saying something they need to be heard the first time and do not intend to repeat. I am not interested in a situation where I do the work and someone else decides what it's worth after the fact. I've been in that situation. It ends the same way every time. Colton looked at her steadily. Miss Mercer, he said, I have never in my life shorted a person who worked honestly for me. Ask anyone in this town who's ever done business with me. He paused. Ask anyone except Potts. Something moved through her expression, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of the consideration of trust, which was a different thing, and in some ways more meaningful. There's a wagon on the south side of the building, he said. I'll be loaded and ready to leave within the hour. He put his hat back on and moved toward his horse. Mr. Vance, she said. He turned. I don't need looking after, she said. I need the work. Good, he said, because I don't have time to look after anyone. I need someone who already knows how to look after themselves. She said nothing, but when he went around the building to the wagon, he heard her footsteps on the road behind him. She ate on the wagon, slowly and without apology, while Colton drove the team north out of Harlan's Crossing. She didn't make conversation about the food or explain herself or perform gratitude. She simply ate what her body needed, methodically and with attention, and watched the mountains getting larger through the trees, and Colton drove and let her be. After a time he said, How long have you been in town? 4 days, she said. Where before that? Came west from Ohio originally. Spent the last 3 years in Wyoming Territory, working for a family. She paused. They moved east. I wasn't invited along. Being left behind. She looked at him. Is that your business? No, he said. But I'm asking. She considered him for a moment. More often than it should, she said. He nodded. He kept his eyes on the road. He had learned, in the years since his wife died and his son with her, and his reason for being among people with them, that there was a kind of person who needed silence more than they needed conversation, and that the right thing to do was to provide whichever one they needed without making a point of it. Rosalind Mercer, he was already beginning to understand, was a person who needed both. Often at the same time. The man who left, she said, after the silence had run its course. The one who managed your accounts. Why did he really leave? Colton's jaw tightened slightly. Said he had better prospects in Billings. Did he? Hard to say. He didn't stay long enough in Billings for anyone to find out. He paused. Took my bookkeeping records when he went. 18 months of them. Rosalind turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd gotten on the wagon. He took your records, or lost them. I was never able to determine which. What was his name? Daly. Miles Daly. She filed that away. He could see her doing it, the particular expression of a person storing information, because they don't yet know how important it might become. And you reconstructed what you could from memory, she said. What I could. It's not complete. How confident are you in the figures you reconstructed? Moderately, he said, the broad strokes I'm sure of. The specific numbers I'm less certain about. Which specific numbers? He glanced at her. The September cattle sales, mostly. The figures I remember don't match what I'd have expected, based on the market that time of year, but I assumed I was remembering wrong. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. And, you think you were remembering wrong? She said carefully. Something in the way she said it made him look at her again. I did think that, he said slowly. But, she said. He was quiet. Mr. Vance, she said, I've managed financial records for 4 different households in the last 6 years. I have seen what honest accounting errors look like, and I have seen what the other kind looks like. If the September figures are off in the direction I think you're suggesting, that is not usually an honest error. A muscle worked in his jaw. No, he said. I don't suppose it usually is. The wagon climbed in silence for a while after that. Then Rosalind said, Show me everything you have when we arrive. All of it. Whatever you reconstructed, whatever original documents you kept before he came, any correspondence from buyers or suppliers. Everything. That's a considerable amount of work for your first evening, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She said it the way someone says something that is simply a fact and not a complaint. And he found with the particular surprise of a man who had spent years, assuming he was past being surprised by people, that he did not feel the need to argue with her about it. They reached the ranch as the late afternoon sun started its long golden lean toward the mountains. Rosalind got down from the wagon without waiting for assistance and stood in the yard for a moment. Reading it the way he had already begun to understand, she read everything quickly, thoroughly, storing the information without letting her expression reveal what she thought of it. The garden needs attention, she said. I know. The gate on the fence post is hanging wrong. It'll break within the month if it's not reset. I'll add it to the list. What's in the small outbuilding? Feed storage. It's disorganized. I can see that from here. She turned toward the cabin. Show me the records. Almost. Inside, the cabin told its story the way all spaces did, honestly, without flattery, whether the inhabitant wanted it to or not. Rosalind moved through it with her eyes rather than her hands, mapping what was there and what was missing, and what had been where it was for so long it had stopped being a choice and become simply a habit. You cook for yourself, she said, looking at the kitchen. I do. How long have you been alone here? He went to the trunk at the back of the cabin and began pulling out the older records. 8 years, he said, without turning around. Give or take. The phrasing give or take was not careless. She heard the precision in the imprecision. A man who said 8 years with a give or take attached was a man who knew exactly how long it had been and had reasons for keeping the number inexact, even to himself. She didn't ask more. Not yet. He brought the records to the table, and she sat down and opened the first ledger, and within minutes was deep inside the numbers, the way other people got deep inside books gone from the room in every meaningful sense while remaining physically present. Colton put a pot on the stove. He was not an exceptional cook, but he was a competent one, which was all that had ever been required, and the smell of something warm began to move through the cabin while Rosalind worked. 20 minutes in, she stopped. He came to the table. She had 2 pages open side by side, one from the original ledgers, one from his reconstruction. These are the September cattle figures, she said. She pointed at a column in the original record. This is what the herd looked like going into that season. This is what you paid in transport fees to get them to the Billings buyers. She moved her finger. And she pointed at his reconstruction, is what Daly recorded as the sale amount. Right, he said. It's short, she said. That's what I thought. Not possibly remembered wrong short, she said, looking up at him. Not rounding error short. She held his gaze. Deliberately short. By exactly the margin that would look like a bad season if you weren't checking carefully, but that would add up to a significant sum over the full year. The kitchen had gone very quiet. How significant, he said. She told him. He put both hands on the table and looked at the numbers for a long moment. That's not all of it, she said, her voice careful but not soft. He looked up. There are 3 other entries across these 8 months that follow the same pattern. She turned the ledger toward him. Whoever was recording this wasn't greedy. That's what makes it hard to see. A greedy man takes big amounts. This man took small amounts, consistently, knowing that small amounts look like noise. Daily, Colton said. Most likely, she said. But I'd want to verify against the buyer records. If you have any correspondence from the Billings buyers directly. I have letters, he said. And get them, she said. He got them. She spent 2 more hours working while the food sat keeping warm on the stove and the lamp burned and the mountains pressed dark and permanent against the glass. And by the time she looked up again, she didn't need to say anything because her expression had already said it. All of it, he said. All of it, she confirmed, consistent. Careful. Spanning the full 18 months he was here. She set down the pen she'd been using. He was experienced at this. It wasn't his first time. Colton stood at the window with his back to her. She gave him the silence. Then he turned, and his expression was not the expression of a man who had just lost money. It was something older and colder than that, the expression of a man who had trusted and been methodically, quietly, deliberately betrayed over a period of 18 months while he was out in the fields working the land he'd built alone. Is there a way to prove it, he said. Yes, she said. I can build a complete comparative record from what you have. It will take time, but yes. And one more thing. What? She pulled one of the letters forward on the table. This letter from your Billings buyer, from October of that year. Read the 3rd paragraph. He came to the table and read it. When he looked up, something had changed in his face. He's referencing a payment he made to a collection agent, Colton said slowly. Not to me directly. A payment to an agent for the September delivery. Yes, she said. I never used a collection agent. No, she said. The room went very quiet. Which means Daly set up a separate entity, Colton said, and his voice had gone very flat and very controlled, which she was already beginning to understand was more dangerous than anger, to receive money that should have come to me, and recorded a lower number in my own book so I would never know the difference. That's what the document suggests, she said. He was silent for a long moment. Then, Miss Mercer. Yes? How did you see that in 2 hours when I've been looking at those records for 2 months and missed it entirely? She met his eyes. Because, she said quietly, I've spent my whole life being underestimated by people who assumed I wasn't paying attention. She paused. So I made sure I always was. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The way almost no one had looked at her since she could remember, and what was in his expression was not pity, and it was not performance, and it was not the calculated warmth of someone who wanted something from her. It was recognition, the simple, rare, almost unbearable recognition of one person actually seeing another. Eat, he said. The food's been ready for an hour. She almost smiled. He turned back to the stove and she closed the ledger, and neither of them spoke about what had just passed between them. But it stayed in the room. It stayed in the room the way the important things always do, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet permanence of something that has found the place it belongs and has no intention of leaving. After dinner, When the lamp was burning low and Colton had said good night and gone to his end of the cabin, Rosalind sat alone at the table for a moment in the thick mountain silence. In her bag, the worn cloth bag she had carried into Harlan's Crossing 4 days ago with 11 cents, and no prospect she had carried something else besides her clothes and her few possessions. A small journal, her father's handwriting on the first page. Numbers don't lie, Rosie. Learn to read both. She pressed her hand flat against the cover. She had read both tonight. And what she had read told her one thing clearly: Miles Daly had not simply stolen from Colton Vance and disappeared. A man that careful, that patient, that deliberate, he had a reason for leaving when he did. And somewhere in those letters, in that collection agent arrangement, in the careful small thefts that added up to something substantial, there was a name she hadn't found yet, a name behind the name. She was going to find it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and the mountains outside were dark and enormous, and full of things she didn't yet know, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, that felt less like a threat and more like a promise. She found the second name on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she arrived. It wasn't in the ledgers. It wasn't in the letters from the Billings buyers. It was in a single piece of correspondence she almost missed entirely, a folded note tucked inside the back cover of a supply catalog from 1882. The kind of thing that falls into a book and gets forgotten until someone actually empties the shelf instead of just dusting around it. Rosalind had been reorganizing the storage shelf beside the kitchen window when her fingers found the edge of paper that didn't belong. She unfolded it slowly. It was short, 8 lines. Written in a hand she didn't recognize, on paper that was better quality than anything else in the cabin, the kind of paper that came from a real office, not a frontier outpost. The arrangement is acceptable. Quarterly transfers as discussed. The Vance property remains the priority target. Do not draw attention before the survey is complete. VH. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor right where she was, because her legs had made that decision before her mind caught up with it. VH. She was still sitting there when she heard Colton's boots on the porch. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her on the floor, with the catalog in her lap and the note in her hand. "What happened?" he said immediately. She looked up. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, rather than sitting, which was, she would later think, exactly the right instinct, getting level with her, not above her. "Show me," he said. She held out the note. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, and saw the moment the initials landed the slight tightening around his eyes, the stillness that moved through his whole body like a current. "V," he said. "Do you know who that is?" she said. He stood up slowly. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she let him have it, the way he had let her have things, because some information needs a moment of space between the receiving and the responding. "Vincent Holloway," he said. She had not heard that name before. But the way Colton said it, quiet, flat, the way a man says the name of something he has been trying not to think about, told her everything she needed to know about the weight it carried. "Who is he?" she said. Colton turned from the window. "He owns the Holloway Land and Cattle Company out of Helena," he said. "Operates about 60 miles of territory to the east of here. Been expanding west for the last 4 years, buying up properties, consolidating, building something." He paused. 3 ranches between here and his eastern holdings have sold in the last 2 years. All of them said they sold willingly. 2 of those ranchers were men I knew. Neither of them wanted to leave. Rosalind got to her feet. "But they sold," she said. "They sold," he said. "And now a note with Holloway's initials turns up hidden in your supply catalog," she said, "alongside 18 months of systematic theft, from your accounts, by a man who left before you could ask him questions." Colton looked at her. "Daly was working for him," he said. It wasn't a question. Daly was working for him, she confirmed. And the theft wasn't only about the money, or at least not primarily. A struggling ranch sells more easily than a solvent one. If your record showed you operating at a loss for 18 months, I'd be looking for a buyer, Colton said. Or a buyer would come looking for you, she said, and you'd be in a weak enough position that you'd take whatever they offered. The room was very quiet. Outside, one of the ranch horses moved in the paddock, and the sound of it ordinary, domestic, alive was somehow the sharpest thing in that moment. He wanted the land, Colton said. He wanted the land, she said. And he was patient about getting it. Colton turned the note over in his hands. There's enough to go to someone with? Not yet, she said. A note with initials is suggestive, not conclusive. We need the connection between Holloway and Daly documented. We need the collection agent records the payments that bypassed you and went somewhere else. And we need to understand what the survey reference means. She looked at him steadily. It says the survey isn't complete, which means whatever Holloway wants this land for, he hasn't finished determining how much it's worth. There's a mineral deposit, Colton said, and the words came out flat and certain, as though he'd known this piece of the puzzle and simply hadn't understood where it fit until now. Northeast corner of my property. I've known about it since my father worked this land. Didn't know what kind, nobody's ever properly surveyed it. Just a formation in the rock face that looks like it might be something. Rosalind stared at him. You have a potential mineral deposit on your property, she said. I have a rock formation that might be nothing, he said. Or might be the reason, she said, that a man like Vincent Holloway is spending money and patience arranging for your ranch to fail quietly. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Colton picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I need to ride the northeast fence line, he said. I want to look at that formation again. I'm coming, she said. He stopped. He looked at her, and she met his look with the particular steadiness of a woman who had already done the arithmetic on this situation and had no intention of sitting in the cabin while the answers were out on the land. Do you ride, he said. She said. He nodded once. Give me 10 minutes. She was ready in 8. They rode out along the northern edge of the property in the early morning quiet, the kind of quiet that mountain country produces that is not actually silent but layered wind in the upper trees, the movement of small animals in the brush, the sound of the horses breathing marking time against the ground. Colton rode ahead and slightly to the left, which she understood was not dismissiveness but habit, the way a man who has ridden alone for years positions himself without thinking. She didn't comment on it. She simply rode where she rode and let the land tell her what it could. How long did Daly work for you, she said. 1.5 years, Colton said. Came recommended by the feed merchant in Harlan's Crossing. Good with numbers, reliable seeming, didn't ask too many questions. Or asked exactly the right ones, she said. He glanced back at her. The questions a man asks when he's starting a job tell you a lot, she said. Whether he wants to know how things work or whether he wants to know where the boundaries are. He asked where the property lines ran, Colton said slowly. First week. Said he wanted to understand the full scope of the operation. And you told him. I told him, including the northeast corner. Colton faced forward again, including the northeast corner, he said. They rode in silence for a stretch, and then she said, did he ever ask about the rock formation specifically? Once, Colton said. I told him it was probably nothing. He didn't ask again. He didn't need to, she said. He'd already sent word to Holloway. Colton pulled up the horse. They had come to the northeast edge of the property, where the tree line thinned and the land rose steeply toward a rock face that pushed out of the mountain's shoulder like something the mountain had decided to show the world, whether the world was interested or not. He got down and she got down beside him, and they stood looking at the formation. There, he said. She looked where he was indicating a section of exposed rock where the mineral composition changed visibly. Different color, different texture, running in a vein about 8 feet wide through the face of the stone. She was not a mining expert. She did not need to be. She could see why someone would want to know what that was. "We need someone who knows what they're looking at," she said. "There's a geologist in Helena," he said. "Man named Garrett. He's been to this territory before, surveying for the railroad. He's honest. Can you get him out here without Holloway knowing?" she said. Colton looked at her. "You think Holloway has people in Harlan's Crossing," he said. "I think a man who arranged 18 months of quiet theft through a trusted employee and is patient wait for a survey to complete before making his move," she said, "does not leave the information network to chance." He was quiet for a moment. "The feed merchant," he said. "The one who recommended Daly. I'd start there," she said. Something moved through his face, not anger, not yet, but the deep, cold recalibration of a man realizing that the map he had been using to understand his world was significantly wrong, and that the wrongness went further back than he'd thought. "I trusted that man for 12 years, he said. "I know," she said. "He was at my wife's funeral." She said nothing. She simply stood beside him in the mountain quiet and let him have the moment, because some betrayals need a moment to become real before a person can decide what to do with them. After a while, he said, "Her name was Clara. It came out of nowhere and also from somewhere very deep. She died 8 years ago," he said. "Our son with her. Winter fever. There was a doctor 2 days' ride away and the storm came in before I could get back with him." He paused. "I built this place for them originally. The cabin. The garden. All of it." Rosalind looked at the rock face. "And then you stayed," she said. "Didn't know what else to do," he said. She understood that. She understood it in the particular way of a person who has also stood at the edge of a life that stopped making sense and chosen to keep moving through it anyway, not because they were brave, but because stopping felt worse. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your son." He nodded once, the way he nodded at things that were true and painful, and too large for more words than that. They rode back in a different kind of silence, not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said something real and are still feeling the shape of it. When they came back to the ranch yard, Tom Briggs was waiting by the barn. Tom was the senior of Colton's 2 ranch hands, a lean, weathered man of about 50, with a face that had been rearranged by weather and years into something that was mostly angles and expression. He had been working this land for 6 years, which made him the person on the property who knew it best after Colton himself. He had been politely, carefully, professionally skeptical of Rosalind since she arrived. Not hostile, never hostile, simply watchful, in the manner of a person who has seen arrangements come and go, and has learned not to invest in any of them until they proved themselves worth the investment. He had watched her work for 3 weeks now without comment. "There's a rider coming up the South Trail," Tom said when they rode in. "Don't recognize him." Colton swung down description. "Well-dressed," Tom said. "Too well-dressed for the trail. Riding a horse that cost more than most people's houses." He paused. "He's not a regular." Colton and Rosalind looked at each other. "How far out?" 20 minutes, Tom said. "Maybe less. Get Jesse and have him stay close to the barn," Colton said. Quietly, and went. Rosalind said, "The note. And everything I've been working on. Where do you want it?" "Trunk," Colton said. "Back room, under the survey maps." She went inside while he waited in the yard. And she had everything secured and was back on the porch with a dishcloth in her hands, the universal frontier signal of a woman engaged in domestic activity, and therefore presumably harmless by the time the rider came up the South Trail. He was exactly as Tom had described. About 45, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that belonged in Helena or Denver rather than a mountain ranch yard. He had a carefully maintained appearance, groomed, pressed, deliberate, and he sat his horse the way men sit horses when they want you to know the horse is expensive. He looked at the yard. He looked at Colton. He looked briefly and dismissively at Rosalind on the porch. He did not look at her long enough to worry about her. That was his first mistake. Mr. Vance, he said, with the particular tone of a man who is accustomed to knowing people's names before they've introduced themselves. I'm Marcus Webb. I represent certain business interests in the Helena area. Get down then, Colton said. Not warmly but not rudely either. The straightforward hospitality of a man who extends courtesy as a matter of principle and nothing more. Webb got down. He didn't tie his horse, a small thing, but Rosalind noticed it. A man who doesn't tie his horse is a man who doesn't expect to stay long, which meant this visit was not a negotiation. It was a delivery. I'll get water, Rosalind said from the porch. Neither man acknowledged her. She went inside. She moved to the window above the kitchen basin, the one that faced the yard, the one with the loose frame she'd been meaning to mention to Colton. The one that happened to be positioned exactly right for a person to hear a conversation happening near the porch steps if that person stood very still and made no noise at all. She stood very still. I represent a party interested in acquiring land in this area, Webb said. Mountain properties with good water access and northern grazing range. My client is prepared to offer well above market value for the right parcel. I'm not selling, Colton said. You haven't heard the offer. Doesn't change my answer, Mr. Vance, Webb said, and his tone shifted slightly, not threatening, but moving in that direction the way weather moves before a storm makes itself obvious. I've seen the financial records associated with this property. The recent ones. A ranch operating at the margins you've been dealing with would benefit substantially from. What record said? The question came out very quiet. Webb paused. Public filings, he said, standard research. My financial records aren't public, Colton said. Nothing I've filed in this county would tell you what my margins looked like for the last 18 months. Another pause. General assessments, Webb said. Based on market conditions, land type. You said records, Colton said. You said the financial records associated with this property. I want to know where you got them. The silence this time was different. Rosalind pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the window. My client is prepared to be generous, Webb said, pivoting with the smooth ease of a man who does this for a living. The offer would allow you to relocate comfortably, establish yourself elsewhere. Who is your client? Colton said. I'm not at liberty. Then we're done, Colton said. You can ride back the way you came. Mr. Vance, I said we're done. A long moment then. The sound of Webb getting back on his horse. This property is going to change hands, Webb said, from above, one way or another. My client has resources and patience. It would be better for you if the change happened on terms you agreed to. Is that a threat? It's a reality, Webb said. There's a difference, he wrote out. Rosalind came back through the door with a cup of water that nobody needed. Colton was still standing in the yard watching the south trail. He knew about the 18 months, she said. He knew about the 18 months, Colton confirmed. Which means Holloway has seen Daly's records, she said. The real ones. The ones that show what he was actually taking. Colton turned to look at her. Which means Holloway and Daly didn't just have an arrangement, she said. Holloway has been holding those records as an asset. As proof of how weakened this operation has become. She paused. Which means they exist somewhere, physically, and if we could find them. We'd have the connection, Colton said. We'd have everything, she said. They stood in the yard in the afternoon light, and between them the weight of what had just happened, settled, like something physical, the understanding that this was no longer a financial dispute to be corrected with better bookkeeping. This was something larger, something that had been planned and was still being executed. And somewhere in the territory, Miles Daly was sitting on 18 months of records that could destroy Colton Vance or, in the right hands, destroy the man who had sent him. I'm going to write to Garrett, Colton said, the geologist. I'll find a way to get word to him that doesn't go through anyone in Harlan's Crossing. There's a postal rider who goes through the northern pass, Tom said from behind them. He had come back around the barn quietly enough that neither of them had heard him. His expression said that he had heard enough of what needed to be heard. Stops at the Henderson place on Thursdays. He doesn't go through town. Colton looked at him. You've used him before, he said. Once or twice, Tom said. When there was something I didn't want Harlan's Crossing to know my business about. He paused. I reckon this might be a similar situation. Colton held his foreman's eyes for a moment. How much did you hear, he said. Enough, Tom said. I heard enough. He turned toward the barn without another word. Then stopped. Mr. Vance, he said, without turning around. The man that recommended Daly to you. The feed merchant. What about him? His store got a new sign last spring, Tom said. New equipment, too. For a man whose business I'd have called steady but not exceptional, it was a considerable upgrade. He went into the barn. Rosalind looked at Colton. Colton looked at the south trail where Marcus Webb had disappeared. It goes deeper than I thought, he said. It usually does, she said. That's how things like this stay hidden long enough to work. She went back inside and pulled out the ledgers and went back to work, because the only thing she knew to do with the particular cold feeling that had settled in her chest was to go after the numbers and not stop until they told her everything. She worked through the late afternoon and into the evening, and slowly, entry by entry, comparison by comparison, cross-referenced against every letter and record and scrap of documentation, she could lay hands on a picture began to emerge. Not just of what had been taken, but of how it had been arranged. Holloway wasn't doing this to Colton alone, the 3 ranches that had sold in the last 2 years. She pulled their locations from memory. Colton had mentioned them on the ride back, brief references to men he'd known who hadn't wanted to leave. She drew the geography in her mind. All 3 were on the western approach to the mountain range. All 3 had sold within 2 years of Holloway's expansion. And Colton's ranch sitting at the northern point of what would be, if you connected those properties, a significant territorial block was the last piece. She set down the pen. She had built financial records from scraps and memory and the careful analysis of patterns before. She had, in the year after her father died, rebuilt the entire accounting of his estate from nothing in an attempt to prove what had been done to it. She had failed that time. She was not going to fail this time. Colton, she said. He came to the table. She turned the paper she'd been working on to face him. These are the 3 ranches, she said, indicating the rough diagram she'd drawn. These are their sale dates. This is your property. He looked at it. He's building a corridor, Colton said. A corridor, she confirmed, from his eastern holdings to the mountain range. Your ranch closes the gap. Without it, he has a broken chain. With it, she paused. With it, he controls the primary western access route through the mountains, plus whatever that mineral deposit turns out to be worth. Colton sat down across from her. For a moment, he said nothing. He looked at the diagram, and then he looked at his hands on the table, and then he looked at her. You put this together from the ledgers, he said. From the ledgers and the letters, and what you told me on the ride, she said. And from the note. In one afternoon, he said. In one afternoon, she said. He shook his head slowly. Miss Mercer, he said. Rosalind, she said. Because she had decided, somewhere in the last several hours, that a woman who had spent an afternoon dismantling a land conspiracy was entitled to use her first name with the man she was dismantling it on behalf of. He looked at her. Rosalind, he said. And there was something careful and real in the way he said it, as though the word itself was something he was deciding to handle properly. Why are you doing this? Because it's the job, she said. No, he said. It stopped being just the job when you pulled that note out of the catalog. You could have handed it to me and let me handle what came next. Instead, you've spent the entire day building me a case. She was quiet for a moment. My father lost everything he built, she said, because someone was patient and careful and systematic about taking it, and because nobody around him had the skills to see what was happening until it was too late. She met his eyes. I have the skills, and I'm not going to sit on them while the same thing happens to someone else. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the mountain night had come down completely deep, dark, enormous. Indifferent to everything happening inside this cabin, the way the natural world is always magnificently indifferent to human trouble. You should know, Colton said, after a while, that this isn't going to be simple. Holloway has money and connections. What we have is paper and a theory. We have more than a theory, she said. We have a documented pattern, a physical note with the initials. Geologist who can tell us what that rock formation is worth, which will tell us exactly how motivated Holloway is. And if he's very motivated, Colton said. She held his gaze. Then we make sure we're more prepared than he expects, she said. He sent Webb today because he thought you were isolated and financially weakened and easy to intimidate. She paused. He doesn't know what's happened in this cabin in the last 3 weeks. Colton looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not in the way things shift in stories when a man suddenly understands something. More quietly than that. The way understanding actually arrives, which is slowly and incompletely, and with the particular quality of a thing you suspected was true before you had the words for it. No, he said, he doesn't. Rosalind closed the ledger. Get word to your geologist, she said, through the northern pass, like Tom said. I want to know what we're actually dealing with before Holloway's next move. And if his next move comes before we hear back from Garrett. She looked at the ledgers stacked on the table. 3 weeks of work. An entire architecture of evidence, patient and detailed and building towards something she could feel but not yet fully see. Then we'll be ready, she said. Because I am not going to let another careful man destroy another good thing while everyone around him pretends not to see it. She said it quietly, but in the mountain silence of that cabin, with the lamp burning between them and 8 years of a man's solitary survival on the table in ledger form, it landed like something absolute. Like a promise made to more than one person. Like a promise made to her father, too. Garrett's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Colton sent word through the northern pass. Tom brought it in from the Henderson place without stopping to unsaddle his horse first, which told Rosalind everything she needed to know about how he had the situation before she even took the envelope from his hand. She and Colton opened it together at the kitchen table. Garrett was a man of precise language, a professional habit, Rosalind assumed, of someone whose work required him to say exactly what he meant and nothing more. His letter ran to 2 pages. The first page was procedural confirmation of the request, timeline for travel, conditions of engagement. The second page was 4 sentences. Based on your description and the formation characteristics you've outlined, the vein you're describing on the northeast face is consistent with copper-bearing ore deposits found in the northern Montana range. If the formation runs to depth as the surface exposure suggests, the reserve value could be substantial. I've seen smaller surface exposures yield operations worth considerable sums to territorial mining interests. I will come as soon as the mountain trail permits safe passage, which I estimate at 10 days from this writing. Colton set the letter down. Copper, he said. Substantial reserve value, Rosalind said. They looked at each other across the table, and in the silence between them was the full weight of what that meant, not just the money, not just the land, but the confirmation that everything she had built from ledgers and letters and one folded note was true. Holloway hadn't sent Daly to this ranch because of the grazing land, or the water access, or the mountain corridor, though all of those things mattered. He had sent Daly because somewhere in his network of surveyors and contacts and careful information gathering, he had learned what was in that rock face before Colton knew it himself. He's known for longer than we have, she said. Yes, Colton said. Which means his timeline isn't casual, she said. He's been building toward this specifically. The 3 ranches, the corridor, Daily, all of it was pointed at this property, at this deposit. How long do you think he's known? Colton said. She had been thinking about that since she first read the letter's second page, running the timeline against the record she had memorized over the past weeks. Daly arrived here approximately 22 months ago, she said. The first of the 3 western ranches sold 26 months ago. I think Holloway had the geological assessment done privately somewhere between 3 and 4 years back, and then he started building the acquisition plan. She paused. He's been patient. 4 years of planning, Colton said. At least, she said. He stood and walked to the window and stood there the way he stood when he was thinking through something that required the full weight of his attention, still, focused, present, in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. Garrett needs to get here before Holloway makes his next move, he said. Yes, she said, and we need to know what that move is going to be. She had been thinking about Webb's visit for 11 days. The man had come, delivered his message, been refused, and left, and then nothing. No follow-up, no second approach. 11 days of quiet that felt less like retreat and more like the pause before something deliberate. He's not going to come back with another offer, she said. Webb told you the property would change hands one way or another. He meant it. So what's the other way? Colton said. She had 3 theories. She had been sitting with all 3 of them for days, turning them over, looking for which one fit the shape of what she knew about Vincent Holloway, a man patient the plan across 4 years. Careful enough to use a middleman who used a middleman, connected enough to have eyes in a town 60 miles from his primary operations. Legal pressure, she said. If he can manufacture a claim against the property, a debt, a disputed boundary, a tax irregularity, he can use the courts to force a sale. It takes time, but it's clean, no violence, no obvious connection to him. Or, Colton said, or he accelerates. If he knows Garrett is coming and if he has someone watching this ranch, which I think we have to assume, he might decide he can't wait for the legal approach. And the third? Colton said. She looked at him steadily. He goes after the evidence, she said. If someone told him that the situation here has changed in the last 3 weeks, that there's a woman in this cabin who has been through his records and is building a case, the most efficient thing he can do is make sure the case doesn't reach anyone who can act on it. The room went very quiet. You think he'd send someone for the documents, Colton said. I think he'd send someone for the documents, she said. And I think we shouldn't assume the documents are safe where they are. Colton crossed back to the table in 3 strides. Tom, he said. Tom was in the barn. Colton went to the door and called his name. And 30 seconds later, the foreman was in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression of a man who has been half expecting a conversation like this and has already been thinking about what he'd say. We need to move the records, Colton said, and I need to know if anyone's been watching this property. Tom was quiet for a moment. There's been a rider on the South Ridge, he said. Last 4 days. Different times, different horse, but the same spot. I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain. Rosalind looked at Colton. He's been watching since Webb's visit, she said. Jesse noticed it, too, Tom said. We didn't want to alarm anyone until we were sure. Where's Jesse now? South pasture, Tom said. Get him in, Colton said, quietly. I don't want that rider on the ridge to see anything that looks like we're preparing for something. Tom left. Rosalind was already at the trunk in the back room, lifting out the records she had spent 3 weeks assembling, the original ledgers, the reconstructed accounts, the cross-referenced letters. The carefully documented comparison she had built to show the pattern of theft, and the note with Holloway's initials, which she had wrapped separately in oilcloth the day she found it. She carried it all to the kitchen and looked at it on the table. Where, she said. Henderson Place, Colton said without hesitating. I trust Bill Henderson with my life. Have for 20 years. Is he connected to Harlan's Crossing? He does his business in Milford, Colton said. He's got no reason to go through town, and he doesn't. Then Henderson, she said. She began organizing the documents into a packet, the kind that could be sealed and carried without making its contents obvious. She worked fast and methodically, and Colton watched her do it without offering to help, not because he was passive, but because he understood that this particular task required exactly the hands it was in. I'm going to make a copy, she said, of the key documents. Partial enough to work from if the originals are lost, not enough to be the whole case on their own. We keep that here, hidden separately. Where here, he said. She thought for a moment. The feed storage outbuilding, she said. Tom said it's disorganized. That's useful. Nobody looks carefully in a disorganized space. They look at the surface and assume the chaos is random. It is random, Colton said. It won't be anymore, she said. She was making the partial copy when Jesse Briggs came in from the south pasture. He was younger than Tom by about 15 years, dark-haired, quick-moving, with the kind of alertness that came from growing up in country where things happened fast and you needed to know which things mattered. He saw the papers on the table and looked at Colton. How bad, he said. Bad enough, Colton said. Tell me about the rider on the ridge. Jesse sat down without being asked. 4 days straight, he said. Comes up mid-morning, stays 2-3 hours, has a glass long range, good quality. He's not there by accident. Did he see you see him? Rosalind asked. Jesse looked at her, the particular look of a young man, recalibrating his assessment of a woman he had not previously considered a strategic partner in anything. No, ma'am, I made sure of that. Good, she said. She kept writing. Has anyone been into Harlan's Crossing from this ranch in the last 2 weeks? Tom went for feed 8 days ago, Jesse said. She looked up at Tom. Did you speak to the feed merchant, she said. Tom's jaw tightened. He asked about the ranch, he said slowly. I thought it was ordinary conversation. What did he ask? Whether things were settling down after Daly left, Tom said. Whether Colton had found reliable help. The room was silent. What did you say, Colton asked. I said things were fine, Tom said. That there was a woman managing the house now. I didn't say more than that. It was enough, Rosalind said, not unkindly. He relayed it to Holloway or to Webb, and that's when the rider on the ridge appeared. She sealed the packet of documents. It also tells us the feed merchant is still active in this arrangement. Which means Holloway considers this ongoing. He hasn't given up on acquiring the property, Colton said. He can't give up, she said. Not now. Not with a geologist coming and a woman in the cabin who's been through his records. Every day this continues, his exposure grows. She stood up. He's going to move soon. The question is what direction. She found out the answer the next morning. It came in the form of a man she hadn't expected, riding up the North Trail on a good horse, dressed plainly but not poorly, carrying a document case across his saddle. Rosalind saw him from the porch where she'd been sitting with her copywork, and she recognized the type before he was close enough to read his face. She had seen men like this in Ohio, in Wyoming, in every place where there was money being argued over, and someone needed to argue it with authority. He was a lawyer. Colton came out of the barn and stood in the yard when the man rode up, and Rosalind stayed on the porch, and Tom appeared at the barn door without anyone asking him to. Mr. Vance, the man said, getting down with the efficiency of someone who does not waste motion. My name is Aldous Price. I represent a landholdings company registered in Helena. I'm here to serve notice of a legal claim against this property. Colton said nothing. Rosalind set down her pen. Colton said. Price opened the document case and produced a paper which he held out. Colton took it without moving toward him. The lawyer walked the 3 steps to close the distance, which told Rosalind something about the relative power each man understood himself to have in this exchange. Colton read it. His face went very still. He looked up. This says I have an outstanding debt to a land holdings company called Mountain Western Properties, he said. In the amount of $1,400. That's correct, Price said. I've never done business with Mountain Western Properties, Colton said. The company acquired the debt through a secondary transaction, Price said smoothly. From a private individual who held a promissory note against this property, dated, he consulted his own copy, March of 1882. Rosalind was on her feet. She came down the porch steps before she had consciously decided to move, and she held out her hand toward Colton without looking at him. He gave her the document. She read it standing in the yard in the morning light, and she read it fast, the way she read everything not word by word but in blocks, getting the shape of it before getting the detail. March 1882. A promissory note in the amount of $1,400 issued against the Vance property in the northern Montana foothills, signed by one Colton J. Vance, witnessed by one Gerald E. Potts. She looked up at Colton. "Did you sign this?" she said. "No," he said. His voice was absolutely flat. "Did you ever take a loan in March of 1882? No. Did you have any dealings with Gerald Potts beyond purchasing supplies?" Something moved across his face. "Once," he said slowly. "In the spring of 1882, Potts approached me about a water rights agreement. He wanted access to the creek that runs along my southern boundary for some scheme he had. I said no. We had words about it." He paused. "He had me sign a paper declining the agreement." Rosalind looked back at the document in her hands. "Your signature on this," she said, keeping her voice level with some effort, "was taken from that paper. Someone lifted your name and transferred it onto a fraudulent promissory note." The lawyer's expression remained professionally neutral. "Those are serious allegations, Miss Mercer," she said. "And they're not allegations. They're a reading of what's in front of me." She looked at him directly. "The witness on this note is Gerald Potts. The document was held privately for 2 years and then acquired by Mountain Western Properties, a company which, I would be willing to stake considerable effort on proving, is owned or controlled by Vincent Holloway, and now, 2 weeks after Mr. Holloway's representative visited this ranch and was refused, this claim appears. She held the document out toward Price. This is fraud, and the paper trail behind it leads somewhere you do not want your name attached to." Price looked at her. For the first time since he'd ridden up, something other than professional composure was visible in his face. Not guilt, not yet, but the particular discomfort of a man who is beginning to calculate whether the arrangement he walked into is going to cost him more than he was paid for it. "I'm an officer of the court," he said. "I was engaged to serve a legitimate legal—" "Who engaged you?" Rosalind said. "Pause. I'm not at liberty—" "Was it Marcus Webb," she said, "or did Holloway approach you directly?" Price's mouth closed. "That was answer enough, Mr. Price," she said, and she kept her voice quiet and precise, the way her father had taught her to speak, when she needed someone to hear every word. "You have served the notice. You've done what you were paid to do. But I am telling you clearly, as someone who has spent 3 weeks documenting this scheme in considerable detail, that the man who paid you is going to face significant legal consequences. And the question you need to answer for yourself, on your horse on the ride back, is whether you're going to be documented as a participant or as someone who served a notice in good faith and stepped away the moment the fraud was made clear to you." A long silence. "I'll see myself out," Price said. He got on his horse and rode away down the north trail. Colton stood beside Rosalind in the yard, and they watched him go, and Tom stood at the barn door watching him go, and the morning was very still. "Potts," Colton said, and the word came out like something he was tasting for poison. "Potts in this from the beginning," she said. "He recommended daily. He was the witness on the fraudulent note. He's been the local connection, the eyes and the mechanism." She paused. "He's also the weakest link." "How so?" "Because Holloway and Webb are protected by distance and layers," she said. "Potts is here, in that store on the main road, and he is not a careful man." She thought of the way he had spoken to her on her first morning in town, loud, performative, accustomed to an audience. Careful men don't humiliate strangers in public. Careful men don't need witnesses to their power. Potts is Holloway's local instrument, but he's not Holloway's quality. He's going to have made mistakes. "What kind of mistakes?" Colton said. "The kind that leave paper," she said. "If Holloway paid Potts, and he must have, the witness on a fraudulent note doesn't do that for friendship, then there's a payment somewhere." Cash is hard to trace, but men like Potts don't stay quiet about improvements to their situation. They spend it, she looked at Colton. Tom mentioned a new sign. New equipment. New equipment that came from somewhere, Colton said. From somewhere, she agreed. Tom spoke from the barn door. He also added a room onto his house last fall, he said. We all noticed. Nobody asked where the money came from because it wasn't our business. It's our business now, Rosalind said. She went back inside and sat at the table and looked at the fraudulent legal notice and thought carefully and systematically about what she knew and what she needed to know and what order those things needed to happen in. The geological assessment had to come first. Garrett would be here within 10 days, maybe sooner if the weather held. Once they had the formal assessment, they had documented value to attach to the property, which made the fraud not just a personal wrong but a financial crime with a calculable target. The fraudulent note had to be challenged before it went any further through the legal system. That required someone in Helena, someone not connected to Holloway's network, who could file a response and request an investigation into the note's origins. And Potts. Potts needed to be understood completely before he could be approached. Because if he understood what was coming and had time to warn Holloway, everything accelerated in the wrong direction. She was still sitting with all of that when she heard the horse come hard up the south trail, not the measured approach of someone with a purpose, but the fast, urgent movement of someone bringing news. Jesse was back in the yard already. He'd been checking the fence on the south boundary and had apparently been passed by whoever was coming up fast. The rider was a woman, about 30, riding astride the way frontier women rode when there was no time for propriety, her hair coming loose from under her hat. Rosalind didn't recognize her, but Colton did. She saw it in the way he moved toward the yard gate, quickly, the particular quickness of recognition combined with concern. Margaret, he said. What happened? The woman Margaret Henderson, as it turned out, Bill Henderson's daughter-in-law, got down from her horse, and her face was flushed and frightened in equal measure. They came to our place this morning, she said. 3 men. They said they were looking for documents. Said there were stolen business records being held illegally at various properties in the area, and they had authority to retrieve them. Rosalind was on the porch. She came down the steps. Did they take anything? She said. Margaret looked at her. Bill told them he didn't know what they were talking about. They searched the outbuildings. A breath. They didn't find your packet. Bill had moved it last night. He put it under the floor in the root cellar. They didn't look there. Rosalind exhaled slowly. Is Bill all right? Colton said. Shaken, Margaret said, not hurt. But Colton, these weren't ordinary men. They weren't ruffians. They were organized. They had a written order claiming legal authority to retrieve stolen property. Another piece of paper from nowhere, Colton said. Holloway's escalating, Rosalind said. The fraudulent note was the legal pressure. When Price came back and reported how we responded, Holloway moved to the next step. She looked at Colton. He's trying to recover the evidence before Garrett gets here. He knows about Garrett, Colton said. He knows we sent word north, she said. He doesn't know who we sent it to, probably, but he knows we're building toward something, and he's running out of time to stop it quietly. Margaret was looking between them. What do you need? She said. It was said simply, with the directness of a woman who had ridden hard to bring a warning and had no intention of standing aside now that she'd delivered it. Rosalind looked at her. Can Bill hold the packet another week? She said. Safely? He'll hold it as long as you need, Margaret said. He liked Colton's wife. He's not going to let what's his go to men like this. Then go back and tell him we need 1 more week, Rosalind said. And tell him that if anyone comes again, he should send word immediately. Day or night. Margaret nodded and got back on her horse. She was halfway out of the yard when she turned. There's something else, she said. One of the men this morning, the one who seemed to be in charge. He spoke to Bill directly, real polite, real official. And when Bill asked his name, he said it was Daly. The yard went absolutely silent. Rosalind looked at Colton. "He's back," she said. "He's back," Colton confirmed, and his voice had gone to that flat, controlled register that she now recognized as the sound of a man containing something that was going to need to go somewhere before long. "Holloway brought him back," she said, thinking out loud, turning the pieces. "Because Daly knows this property. He knows the land, he knows the outbuildings, he knows what the records look like. If anyone can identify what he's looking for, it's the man who created the records he's looking for." "He was searching Bill Henderson's place," Colton said. "Which means someone told Holloway we'd used Henderson as a relay." "The Northern Pass Rider," she said. "Or someone at the Henderson place itself," Tom said quietly, from behind them. They all looked at him. "I don't mean Bill or Margaret," Tom said. "But they've got a hired man who started last spring. New, from the east. I never paid attention to it before. 1 week. They had 1 week before Garrett arrived, and the evidence at the Henderson place was the only complete record of everything Rosalind had built. And Miles Daly was now somewhere in the territory with Holloway's resources behind him and a very specific purpose in mind." Rosalind went back inside. She sat at the table. She looked at the fraudulent legal notice sitting there in front of her, and she thought about her father, who had been a careful man in most ways but who had trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment and lost everything he'd built because of it. Then she picked up her pen, because the answer to a man who moved quickly and quietly through legal mechanisms was not to hide from those mechanisms. It was to use them better than he did. She began writing a letter. Not to Garrett, not to anyone at the Henderson place. To a lawyer in Helena whose name she had found in the correspondence files, a man who had done legitimate boundary work for Colton 3 years before Daly arrived. A man with no connection to Holloway or Potts or Mountain Western properties. A man who was therefore, by the process of elimination, one of the few people in this situation she had any reason to trust. She wrote clearly and in full, the way her father had taught her. Numbers, dates, document references, the chain of events in order. She was precise about what was proven and careful about what was inferred, because a letter full of accusations without evidence was a useless weapon. A letter that laid out a documented case and requested specific legal action was something else. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she read it through once. Then she called Colton in from the yard. He read it standing at the table. When he finished, he set it down. "This is everything," he said. "Not everything," she said, "but enough to open a formal inquiry. Enough to put Holloway's name in a legal record as a subject of investigation. Enough that if anything happens to this ranch or anyone on it before Garrett gets here, there's already a documented case sitting in a lawyer's office in Helena." He looked at her. "You're protecting us from what comes next," he said. "I'm making what comes next more expensive for him," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet. "Rosalind," he said. "Yes? When this is over," he stopped. "When this is over," she said. "We can talk about when this is over." She folded the letter. "Right now I need you to find me someone who can get this to Helena faster than Holloway's people can intercept it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the door and called for Jesse. And the evening closed down around the mountain ranch, like a held breath, quiet, enormous, full of the particular tension of a situation that has been moving toward something for a long time and has finally decided it is ready to arrive. Jesse rode for Helena before sunrise. Rosalind had been awake since 3 in the morning, adding 2 additional pages to the letter, a detailed accounting of the fraudulent promissory note, a cross-reference to the collection agent payments, and a precise summary of the connection between Mountain Western Properties and the 3 ranches that had sold in the preceding 2 years. She had worked by lamplight with the particular focused quiet of a person who understands that what they are writing matters more than how tired they are. When Jesse came to the door ready to ride, she handed him the sealed packet and looked at him directly. "Don't stop in Harlan's Crossing," she said. "Not for water, not for supplies, not if someone you know calls your name from the road." Yes, ma'am, he said. The lawyer's name is Edward Calloway. His office is on the north side of the main street in Helena, above the surveyor's office. You give that packet to him and nobody else, not his clerk. Understood, Jessie said. And Jessie. She held his eyes. If anyone tries to take that packet from you, between here and Helena, you let them have it. He stared at her. I have a copy, she said. Incomplete, but enough to establish the core of the case. The original is more powerful, but your safety matters more than the difference between them. Something shifted in the young man's face, the particular expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation they thought they had already understood. I'll be careful, Miss Mercer, he said. He rode out into the dark, and Rosalind stood on the porch listening to the hoofbeats until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she went back inside and sat at the table and did not sleep. Because sleeping felt like something she could not afford. Colton found her there 2 hours later when he came in from the early feeding. He looked at her. He looked at the lamp that had been burning since the night before. He went to the stove and put the coffee on without speaking, and she sat and watched him move through the kitchen with the unhurried competence of a man completely at home in the early morning hours of his own life. You should sleep, he said. I will, she said, when Jesse's passed the county line. You can't feel when he passes the county line, he said. No, she said, but I can feel when enough time has passed that it doesn't matter. He set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table. Tell me what happens next, he said, in your head. What's the order of it? She appreciated the question. It was the question of a man who understood that she needed to say it out loud as much as he needed to hear it, that articulating the plan was itself a form of steadying. Calloway receives the letter, she said. Based on what I've outlined, he has grounds to file a formal challenge to the promissory note with the territorial court. That puts the fraudulent claim in legal suspension. Holloway can't pursue it further while it's under investigation. How long does that take? Colton said. To file the challenge days. To get the investigation opened formally, longer, but the filing alone changes the landscape. Once there's an official record questioning the note's legitimacy, Mountain Western Properties can't push the claim forward without exposing themselves. And Garrett, he said. 7 days if the weather holds, she said. His assessment of the copper deposit formally documents the property's mineral value. Once that's on record, the full scope of what Holloway was attempting becomes clear, not just fraud against one rancher, but a systematic scheme to acquire a valuable mineral claim under false pretenses. Which is a federal matter, Colton said. Which is a federal matter, she confirmed. Territorial land fraud with mineral rights implications. That goes above the county level entirely. He drank his coffee. And Potts, he said. She had been thinking about Potts since the previous afternoon, turning over what she knew about him, what she'd observed in the brief and ugly encounter at his store on her first morning in Harlan's Crossing. What Tom and Jessie had told her about the new sign and the new equipment and the room added to his house. Potts is going to break, she said. Not because he's honorable. Because he's frightened, and frightened men, without Holloway's resources, don't hold. You're assuming Holloway has already given up on Potts, Colton said. No, she said. I'm assuming that when Holloway's scheme starts to come apart, and it will start to come apart, once Calloway files, Potts will look at his position and realize he's the most exposed person in this arrangement. He's local. He's visible. He signed his name as witness to a fraudulent note. He's the thread Holloway will cut first to protect himself. And if we go to Potts before Holloway cuts him, she looked at Colton steadily. Then Potts becomes a witness instead of a defendant, she said. Which is a significantly better position for him, and he'll know it. Colton set down his cup. You want to go to Potts, he said. I want to give him the chance to make the right choice, she said. For entirely self-interested reasons, which are the only reasons a man like Potts responds to, she paused. But not yet. Not until Calloway is filed and the note is in legal suspension. Once that happens, Potts' value to Holloway drops to nothing, and his exposure is maximum. That's the moment. You've planned this carefully, he said it. I've had a great deal of night to think in, she said. He almost smiled. In the lamplight of the early morning kitchen, with the coffee between them and the weight of everything pressing down on the room from all sides, it was the closest thing to lightness that the situation permitted. And she held it for a moment before letting it go. She slept for 3 hours after sunrise, deeply and without dreaming, in the way of a body that has finally allowed exhaustion to collect its due. When she woke, the sun was well up, and the ranch was in its midday rhythm, and someone she knew from the smell before she was fully awake had put a covered plate on the small table beside her bed. She sat up and looked at it. Eggs and bread and a small portion of the dried apple preserves she had put up herself 2 weeks ago. On a Sunday afternoon, when the kitchen was the warmest room in the cabin, and the work had felt quietly satisfying in the particular way of making something that would last. She stared at the plate for a moment. Then she ate, methodically and gratefully, and got up and went back to work. The next 4 days passed in a particular kind of tension, not the sharp, event-driven tension of Webb's visit or Margaret Henderson's urgent ride, but the long, stretched tension of waiting for things set in motion to reach their conclusions. Rosalind worked. She completed the partial copy of the case documents, organized them into a sequence that could be understood by someone coming to them fresh. And then she hid them in the feed storage outbuilding, exactly as she'd planned, buried not in any obvious hiding place but incorporated into the apparent disorder of the space. Tucked inside an actual feed record binder that sat in a stack with 11 other binders, all of which looked identical from the outside. Then she waited. Colton rode the property line twice daily, not from anxiety but from discipline, the routine of a man who understood that the best response to uncertainty was the maintenance of ordinary function. Tom and Jesse kept the stock and the fences and said little. The rider on the South Ridge had not reappeared since the morning price came with the legal notice, which meant either Holloway had decided observation was no longer sufficient, or he was repositioning. Neither option was comfortable. On the 5th morning after Jesse left for Helena, Colton came in from the early feeding and said, without preamble, Tom found something on the south fence. She looked up from the ledger. The wire's been cut, he said. Clean, professional, and reset to look intact from a distance. She set the pen down. When, she said. Sometime in the last 2 days, he said. Tom wasn't looking for it specifically, or he'd have found it sooner. We're on the south fence. 300 yards east of the main gate, he said. Near the tree line. She thought about that. 300 yards east of the main gate, near the tree line, was on the approach to the southeast pasture, which was also the approach to the outbuilding, where she'd hidden the partial copy of the case documents. Someone was on the property, she said. Had to be, he said. The cut wire is on the inside of the post, not the outside. You do that coming in, not going out. Did they find anything, she said. Nothing's disturbed that I can see, he said, but I haven't checked everywhere. She stood up. The outbuilding, she said. They went together. The feed storage outbuilding looked exactly as she'd left it, the precise engineered disorder of a space that appeared untouched because it appeared already too chaotic to have been carefully organized. She went directly to the binder stack and pulled the correct one and opened it. The documents were there. She let out a breath she hadn't fully known she was holding. They were looking, but they didn't find it, she said. Daly, Colton said. Has to be, she said. He knows this property. He came through the fence in the place, least likely to be checked, because he'd walked that ground himself. But he doesn't know what I did with the copies because I made them after he left. She replaced the binder and stepped back. He came in, searched what he knew, and left without what he needed. He'll come back, Colton said. Not the same way, she said. And not alone next time. She looked at Colton. We need the Henderson documents back here, she said. Not because this hiding place is compromised, but because having everything in one location secured, organized, ready to present is going to matter when Calloway responds and things start moving. Bill Henderson will bring them, Colton said. I'll send word today. Send not through town. He nodded. Tom left within the hour. He was back before dark, with the full packet from the Henderson root cellar, wrapped in oilcloth and sitting inside a feed sack, which was either Tom's idea or Bill Henderson's, and was in either case exactly the right instinct. Rosalind spent the evening reassembling the full case original documents and partial copy together, organized in the precise sequence that told the story from beginning to end, the way a court would need to receive it. She worked at the kitchen table with Colton sitting across from her, not looking at the documents but present, the way he was present quietly, without performance, just there. At some point she said, without looking up, "You made that plate of food this morning." 5 days ago. It was there when you woke up, he said. You made it, she said. The eggs were going to turn, he said. She kept working, but she felt it, the simple, undemonstrative warmth of it, settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. The letter from Calloway arrived on the 8th day. Jesse brought it back himself, which meant he'd turned around in Helena fast enough that he'd been on the road before she'd fully expected a response, and that told her something about the urgency with which Calloway had received the material. She opened it at the table with Colton standing beside her. Calloway's letter was 3 pages. He wrote with the careful, structured precision of a man who understood that letters could become evidence and chose his language accordingly. He had filed the challenge to the promissory note the morning after Jesse arrived. He had submitted it to the territorial court with a full supporting brief that referenced the documentation she had provided. The fraudulent claim was now in official legal suspension pending investigation. He had also, on his own initiative, forwarded a summary of the material to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Helena, with a formal request for an inquiry into Mountain Western Properties and its acquisition history. She read that line twice. He went further than I asked, she said. Is that a problem? Colton said. No, she said. It means he read the material and understood what it meant without me having to explain it. She kept reading. He says, Mountain Western Properties has been flagged before there were questions about 2 acquisitions in the Eastern Territory 18 months ago, but nothing was filed formally. Our documentation is the first formal complaint. We're not the first people he's done this to, Colton said. No, she said. We're just the first ones who could prove it. She read to the end of the letter. Then she looked up. He wants the original note, she said. The one with Holloway's initials. He says it's the single most important piece in the chain because it demonstrates Holloway's direct awareness of and participation in the scheme, not just beneficial receipt of its outcomes. The note is here, Colton said. I know, she said. The question is how to get it to Helena safely, because Daly knows we have it or suspects we have it, and the South Fent tells us he's willing to come onto the property to look for it. I'll take it myself, Colton said. She looked at him. Holloway knows what you look like, she said. Webb has seen you. Daly has seen you. If you ride for Helena with that note. Then I don't ride through country where those men are likely to be, he said. I know the mountain routes. There are 3 passes that don't touch any road Holloway's people regularly use. I've ridden all of them. She studied him. How long, she said. 4 days out, 4 days back, allowing for the trail, he said. 8 days total. Garrett arrives in approximately 2 days, she said. If you leave after the assessment, then I leave with the assessment and the note together, he said. Calloway gets both at once. She saw the logic of it immediately. The geological assessment combined with the original note delivered together to Calloway and Helena created a complete evidentiary package, the proof of what the land was worth attached to the proof of the scheme to steal it. The combination was more powerful than either piece separately, and it arrived before Holloway had time to construct a counter-narrative. 10 days, she said. 10 days, said. She held his eyes. I'll need you to leave Tom and Jesse here, she said. And I need you to understand that if Daly comes back to this property while you're gone. Tom knows what to do, he said. He's handled worse than Daly. I know that, she said. I need you to understand that I know that, and I'm not asking you to stay. He was quiet for a moment. You're telling me, he said, that you can hold this place without me. I'm telling you, she said carefully, that the most important thing you can do for this ranch right now is ride to Helena. Not stay here. Something moved through his expression, complicated, real. The expression of a man processing several things at once and not certain which one was showing on his face. Rosalind, he said. She waited. When I get back, he said. When this is finished. Yes? He stopped. He looked at the table, at the documents, at everything she had built across weeks of careful, relentless, precise work. I don't know how to say it yet, he said. I just want you to know that I'm going to say it. She held very still. All right, she said quietly. He nodded once and went to see to the horses. Garrett arrived the following afternoon, riding a good mountain horse with a pack animal behind him, loaded with equipment. He was a compact, efficient man of about 50, with the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent decades reading rock faces in varying light conditions. He shook Colton's hand and then looked at Rosalind and extended the same handshake without any visible hesitation, which immediately told her something useful about his character. Show me the formation, he said. No preamble, no social pleasantries. Just the direct desire of a man who wanted to look at the thing he'd come to look at. They rode to the northeast corner. Garrett spent 3 hours at the rock face. He took samples. He measured the vein width and traced it along the surface exposure for its full length. He used instruments Rosalind didn't recognize and took notes in a small book he kept in his coat pocket and didn't share with anyone while he was working. She and Colton stood back and let him work. At one point, halfway through the assessment, Garrett stopped and looked at the rock face for a long moment, without writing anything or using any instrument. Mr. Vance, he said without turning. Yes, Colton said. Who else knows about this formation? Colton looked at Rosalind. That's a longer answer than it might seem, he said. I suspected it might be, Garrett said, and went back to his notes. When he finally turned away from the rock face and came back to where they stood, his expression was that of a man who has confirmed something he expected to confirm and is now organizing how to communicate it. The formation runs to depth, he said. I can't give you a precise reserve figure without drilling, but based on the surface exposure characteristics and the geological profile of this section of the range, I can tell you that what you have is not a marginal deposit. It is a significant one. The copper-bearing ore is high quality. The vein is wide, and if the depth holds as the surface suggests, this is a discovery that territorial mining interests would pay considerably for the rights to develop. Colton was very still. Rosalind said, how considerably? Garrett looked at her. In current market terms, and again, this is without drilling confirmation, you're looking at mineral rights worth somewhere between $40,000 and $200,000, depending on depth and quality consistency. The afternoon was absolutely silent. $200,000, Colton said. At the upper range, Garrett said, with favorable depth and quality. The lower figure is the conservative estimate if the deposit shallows quickly. He paused. Either number makes this the most valuable mineral discovery in this section of the territory in the last decade. Rosalind thought about a man in Helena who had spent 4 years planning carefully, systematically, and patiently to acquire this land before anyone knew those numbers. She thought about 18 months of stolen money. 3 ranches sold by men who hadn't wanted to leave. A fraudulent promissory note witnessed by a store owner who had since acquired unexplained improvements to his property and his life. Miles Daly cutting fence wire on a night when he thought no one would notice. She thought about what $200,000 was worth to a man who had already spent 4 years and considerable resources to get it. Write it all down, she said to Garrett. Everything. In the form of a formal geological assessment document. With your professional credentials attached and your signature. She paused. How quickly can you have it ready? Tomorrow morning, he said. Tonight, she said. He looked at her. Tonight, she said again, and her voice was absolutely level. Please. He looked at Colton. Colton said, you can use the kitchen table. I'll keep the lamp filled. Garrett accepted this without argument, which Rosalind would later think was one of the more useful things about people who were genuinely competent at what they did. They recognized competence in others and adjusted accordingly. They rode back to the cabin. And they had been back less than an hour. Garrett at the table, with his notes and his instruments and his professional precision. Rosalind organizing the document packet for Colton's Helena run. Colton at the stove when Tom came through the door. His face was the face of a man who had run from wherever he'd been, and he had not run because of good news. Ryder just came up the North Trail, he said. Didn't knock. Handed this through the window and turned around before I could get to him. He held out a folded piece of paper. Colton took it and opened it. He read it. He handed it to Rosalind. It was short. The documents you've collected and the letter you sent to Helena have been brought to my attention. I want to make clear that what you think you have and what you can prove are different things. Come to a meeting. Tomorrow. The Harlan's Crossing Saloon. Noon. Come alone, Mr. Vance. We can resolve this privately and to mutual benefit. If you choose the other path, understand that paths through the legal system are long and expensive, and do not always end where the traveler expects. V.H. Rosalind read it twice. Then she set it on the table beside Garrett's assessment notes. He knows about Calloway, she said. He has eyes in Helena, Colton said. He knows about the letter, but he doesn't know what Calloway has already done with it, she said. He thinks this is still containable. He thinks a private meeting alone, his ground gives him the leverage to get you to back down. She looked at the letter again. He's frightened, she said. Colton looked at her sharply. Frightened men make the meeting offer, she said. Confident men don't negotiate. He's offering mutual benefit because his legal position is weakening and he knows it. She paused. Calloway has already filed. The challenge is already on record. Holloway can't undo that. The most he can do now is try to get you to withdraw the complaint before the investigation deepens. I'm not going to a private meeting with Vincent Holloway, Colton said. No, she said. You're not. She picked up the letter. But we're going to respond, she said. And this response is going to tell him something he doesn't know yet. She sat down at the kitchen table beside Garrett, pulled a piece of paper toward her, and began to write. Not a confrontation. A simple, precise, factual communication. She wrote that Mr. Vance would not be attending a private meeting. She wrote that the territorial court had already received a formal challenge to the fraudulent promissory note. She wrote that the Land Commissioner's office in Helena had opened an inquiry into Mountain Western properties. She wrote, and this was the sentence she chose most carefully, that a professional geological assessment of the mineral deposit on the northeast section of the Vance property had been completed that day and would be formally filed with the Territorial Registry within 48 hours. She did not mention Garrett's name. She did not include the figures. She simply established that it was done, that it was documented, and that it was already in motion through channels that could not be quietly redirected. Then she added one final sentence. If Mr. Holloway wishes to speak with anyone regarding these matters, the appropriate contact is Mr. Edward Calloway, attorney, Helena, Montana Territory. She signed it with her own name, not Colton's, her own. She held it out for Colton to read. He read it. He looked at her. You signed it, he said. He doesn't know who I am, she said. Not my name, not my role, not what I've been doing in this cabin for the last 4 weeks. Webb saw me for 10 seconds on a porch with a dishcloth. Daly never came to the property while I was here. She held his eyes. Signing it with my name tells him that the person who built this case exists, has a name, and is not hiding. That's more unsettling than an anonymous letter, and it costs us nothing. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he took the letter and sent Tom to find the North Trail rider, who, as Rosalind had suspected, had not gone far. Men who deliver messages from powerful employers generally wait nearby to carry the response. Tom found him at the tree line. The letter went back north with him. Garrett worked until 2 in the morning and produced a document that was, in Rosalind's professional judgment, exactly what it needed to be: precise, credentialed, unambiguous in its conclusions, and formatted in the manner of an official professional report rather than a letter, which meant it would be received by any court or registry as authoritative rather than opinion. She read every word. She thanked him. He said with the characteristic economy of a man who didn't waste words, "Good luck. You're going to need some of it." "We've made most of our own luck," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." He left the next morning before full light. Colton stood in the yard after Garrett's horse disappeared down the north trail, and the assessment was in the document packet, and the packet was ready, and everything that could be done from this end had been done. He stood with his back to the cabin and looked at the mountains for a long moment. Then he turned. Rosalind was on the porch. "I'm leaving tomorrow before sunrise," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be back in 8 days," he said. "I know," she said. He came up the porch and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the lamplight from the window reflected in his eyes. And he looked at her the way he had looked at the rock formation the afternoon Garrett assessed it, with the particular attention of a man seeing something clearly for the first time after a long time of looking at the surface. "I said I'd tell you something when I found the words," he said. She waited. "I've been alone on this land for 8 years," he said. "And in that time I learned to make peace with what that was. Or I thought I did." He paused. "You've been here 4 weeks, and I don't know how to make peace with the idea of 8 days on the trail without knowing what's happening on this ranch." She held very still. "That's not about the case," he said quietly. "The case will be what it will be. That's about you," he held her eyes. "I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the deliberate, gentle motion of a man who understood that taking someone's hand was not a small thing and was not doing it casually. He held it for a moment. "Rough, warm, 8 days," he said. "8 days," she said. He let go and went inside to prepare for the morning. And Rosalind stood on the porch in the mountain dark, and the case was built, and the letter was sent, and the geologist had done his work, and everything was in motion, and none of that was what she was thinking about. She was thinking about 8 days, and the particular, unfamiliar, quietly terrifying feeling of being someone that another person would be thinking about on the trail. She had been uncounted and invisible for so long that being counted felt like standing in sunlight after a long time indoors. Disorienting. Warm. She went inside. She had work to do. There was always work to do. But for the first time in longer than she could name, the work felt like it was building toward something other than survival. It felt like it was building toward a life. Colton had been gone 4 days when Miles Daly walked into Harlan's Crossing like a man who owned it. Tom brought the news in the early afternoon. He'd heard it from the Henderson boy, who'd ridden past town on his way to the mill and seen Daly coming out of Gerald Potts's store with the particular ease of a man returning to familiar ground. No disguise, no caution. Walking the main road in plain sight, which meant one of two things: either Daly believed the situation had shifted in Holloway's favor, or Holloway had decided that the time for subtlety was finished. Rosalind heard Tom out without interrupting. Then she said, "Did the Henderson boy hear anything?" "Daly was talking to Potts on the sidewalk," Tom said. Loud enough that the Henderson boy caught a few words from across the road. Something about a filing and a name Calloway. She was already moving to the table. "Holloway's people got to someone in Calloway's office," she said. "They know what was filed." "Does that change things?" Tom said. "It changes the timeline," she said. "They know the fraudulent note has been challenged. They know the land commissioner's office has been contacted. What they don't know yet is whether Garrett's assessment has been submitted to the territorial registry." She looked at the copy of the assessment on the table in front of her. "Colton has the original. He's 4 days out. If he's making good time, he should reach Helena tomorrow. And if he's not making good time? Tom said. She didn't answer that, because the answer was one she had already spent considerable energy not dwelling on. Jesse, she said. Jesse appeared from the doorway, where he'd been listening with the directness of a young man who had stopped pretending he wasn't part of this conversation. Yes, ma'am, he said. I need you to ride to the telegraph office in Milford, she said. Not Harlan's Crossing. Milford. Send a wire to Edward Calloway in Helena. Tell him that Miles Daly has been seen in Harlan's Crossing in open communication with Gerald Potts, and that we believe Holloway has information about the filed documents. Tell him to watch for Colton Vance, who should arrive within the next day or two, and to keep the geological assessment secure the moment it arrives. Milford's 2 hours, Jesse said. Then you'd better leave now, she said. He left. Tom stayed. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, with the deliberate manner of a man who had made a decision and was sitting down to say it. Miss Mercer, he said. Tom. I've worked this land for 6 years, he said. I've seen a few things come and go, good seasons, bad ones. The year after Mrs. Vance died, when Colton barely spoke for 4 months and ran this ranch on nothing but habit and anger. He paused. I've never seen anything come onto this property that looked like it could take it. It hasn't taken it yet, she said. No, he said. It hasn't, because you've been sitting at that table. He held her eyes. I want you to know that I see that, and I'm sorry it took me 3 weeks to say it. She looked at him for a moment. You said it now, she said. That's what matters. He nodded once, stood up, and went back to his work. And she turned back to the documents and the questions she had not yet answered, and the particular problem that had been sitting at the edge of her thinking since she'd heard Daly's name. Daly's reappearance was not random. A man like Daly, careful, experienced, professionally dishonest, did not walk into a town in plain sight without a reason. He was either delivering a message, receiving one, or establishing a visible presence so that someone watching would know he was there. Which meant he was meant to be seen, which meant Holloway wanted Colton to know Daly was in Harlan's Crossing. Except Colton wasn't here. She sat with that thought for a long moment. They didn't know Colton was gone. The rider on the South Ridge had not been seen in days. If Holloway's people hadn't been watching closely enough to see Colton leave before sunrise, they might believe he was still on the ranch. Daly's visible arrival in Harlan's Crossing might be intended as a provocation to draw Colton into town, away from the property, into territory where Holloway's local connections were stronger, and the isolation worked in the other direction. She stood up. Tom, she called. He came back to the doorway. Nobody rides into Harlan's Crossing, she said. Not today, not tomorrow. If anyone needs supplies, they wait. If anyone gets a message asking to meet someone in town, they don't go. Understood? Understood, he said. And if a rider comes to this property, anyone, regardless of who they say they are or what they say they're carrying, you come get me before you speak to them. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went back to the table and she worked, and the afternoon settled into the particular waiting stillness that had become familiar over the past weeks, not the peaceful stillness of a ranch in its ordinary rhythm, but the compressed, watchful stillness of a situation approaching its conclusion from a direction that hadn't yet made itself fully clear. The rider came the next morning. Not from the South Trail or the North Trail, but from the east, a direction nobody had been watching closely because it was the hardest approach to the property, up through rough ground that most people wouldn't choose if they had another option. Tom came to get her before he spoke to the rider. She came out onto the porch and looked at the man on the horse and felt something cold and quiet settle in her chest. It was not Daly. It was Potts. Gerald Potts, who had laughed at her across a store counter on a morning that felt like a different lifetime, was sitting on a horse in Colton Vance's yard, looking like a man who had not slept and had ridden hard, and had made a decision that had cost him something he couldn't fully calculate yet. He looked at her. She looked at him. Miss Mercer, he said, and her name in his mouth was nothing like it had been in that store, none of the lazy contempt, none of the performance. Just a name, said by a man who was frightened, Mr. Potts, she said. Is Vance here? No, she said. He processed that. His horse moved slightly and he brought it back with a habitual hand, and she could see him deciding something in real time. Then I'll tell it to you, he said. She came down the porch steps. Get down, she said. Come inside, he hesitated. Mr. Potts, she said, you rode out here through rough country before full light. Whatever you've come to say, you didn't come all this way to say it from a horse. He got down. She put him at the kitchen table with coffee he didn't touch, and she sat across from him and she waited. Because she had learned that the most useful thing you could do when a frightened man had finally decided to talk was simply to give him the space to do it. He talked. It took him a while to get to the substance of it, because men like Potts had spent their whole lives managing how they presented themselves, and the habit didn't disappear just because the situation demanded honesty. There was preamble. There was qualification. There were sentences that started and started again. She let all of it happen, and then the substance arrived. Holloway had paid him. Not once, but repeatedly, payments spread across 2 years, through a land agent in Great Falls who served as intermediary, always in amounts small enough to be individually explained but cumulatively significant. The new sign, the equipment, the room on the house, all of it from Holloway's money. In exchange, Potts had provided local information, introduced Daly as a trustworthy character, witnessed the document that became the fraudulent promissory note, and kept Holloway's people informed about the general mood and activities in Harlan's Crossing. He had not known, he said, about the extent of what Daly was doing to the ranch accounts. She let that claim sit without comment. He had not known, he said, that the document he witnessed would be used as a fraudulent legal instrument. She let that one sit, too. What changed? She said when he stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. Daly came to see me yesterday, he said. You already know that. I know you were seen together, she said. He told me what Holloway wants next, Potts said. He said the legal approach wasn't working fast enough. He said Holloway was considering other methods of resolving the situation. She kept her voice level. What methods? Potts looked up at her. He said accidents happen on mountain ranches, Potts said. Especially in summer when the work is hard and people get careless. The kitchen was absolutely still. He was talking about Vance, Potts said. Or you. He wasn't specific. He said the documents were the problem and the people holding them were the problem, and that Holloway needed both problems resolved before the territorial inquiry went further. She sat with that for 3 seconds, 3 full seconds. Then she said calmly, and you came here to tell me. I'm not. He started again. I made bad choices. I took money I shouldn't have taken. I signed a paper I should have looked at harder. He met her eyes. But I'm not going to sit in my store and let someone get hurt because I kept my mouth shut. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning he had laughed at her across that counter. She thought about the way everyone in that store had looked away. She thought about what it had cost her to walk out with her head up and how close she had come, in those 3 days of hunger before Colton found her, to becoming someone who could not hold her head up anymore. She thought about her father, who had trusted the wrong man and paid for it with everything he'd built. She thought about what forgiveness cost and what it was worth, and whether those were even the right categories for this moment. Then she thought about what she needed, practically and immediately, to protect this ranch and the man who would be riding back to it in 4 days. I need a written statement, she said. Everything you just told me. Dates, amounts, names. The content of your conversation with Daly yesterday, word for word as best you can remember. And your signature, he stared at her. That statement goes to Calloway and Helena, she said. And to the territorial sheriff's office. And Gerald, she used his given name deliberately, for the first time, because this was not a moment for formality. If that statement is complete and accurate, it changes your position in this from participant to witness. Witnesses are treated differently than participants. Your lawyer, if you have one, will tell you the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have paper?" he said. She put paper in front of him. He wrote for 40 minutes. His handwriting was heavy and uneven, a man more accustomed to calculations than sentences. But the content was clear, and the detail was specific, and by the time he set down the pen and signed his name at the bottom, Rosalind had the single most important document. She had not built herself a first-person account from a participant in Holloway's network, describing the scheme from the inside. She read it while he sat. Then she looked up. "One more thing," she said. "The man Holloway used as the land agent in Great Falls. You said payments came through him." "Harmon," Potts said. "Robert Harmon. He runs a legitimate land brokerage, or runs it as cover, more accurately." She wrote the name down. "Does Calloway know about Harmon?" she said, thinking aloud. "I don't know what Calloway knows," Potts said. "He will now," she said. She sealed Potts' statement with the care she brought to everything she considered important, and she wrote a covering letter to Calloway that was 3 paragraphs and contained the name Robert Harmon and the words "threat of physical harm" in plain language, because some things needed to be said plainly. She sent Tom to Milford with it within the hour. Potts left shortly after. He rode back through the rough eastern approach the way he'd come, and she watched him go from the porch, and she felt not warmth for him, not exactly, but something more complicated than the clean contempt of that first morning. A man who had done wrong and then at some cost to himself done one right thing was not a good man. But he was not only one thing either. Neither was she. She went back inside and she sat at the table and she waited. The second day passed. The third. On the morning of the fourth day, Tom came in from the early feeding and said there was a rider on the south trail, moving fast, and the horse looked like a ranch animal rather than a trail horse. And Tom thought, though he wasn't certain, that it moved like a horse that was being ridden hard by someone who knew it. Rosalind was on the porch before Tom finished the sentence. Colton came up the south trail at a pace that told her everything she needed to know about what had happened in Helena before she was close enough to read his face. He got down from the horse while it was still moving, the dismount of a man with news that could not wait for a complete stop, and he came toward the porch with something in his expression that she had not seen there before, not relief exactly, and not triumph, but the complex face of a man on whom several enormous things have just arrived at once. "Calloway filed everything," he said, when he was close enough. "The geological assessment, the original note, the full case document. The Territorial Court has issued a formal freeze on any claims or transfers against this property pending the investigation. Mountain Western Properties has been named in a territorial fraud inquiry." He stopped at the porch steps and looked up at her. "And the Territorial Sheriff's Office in Helena has issued an arrest warrant for Miles Daly." She let out a breath. "Harmon," she said. He stared at her. "The land agent in Great Falls," she said. "Holloway's payment intermediary." "How do you know about Harmon?" he said. "Potts came here," she said. He stared at her for another moment. "Gerald Potts rode out to this ranch," he said slowly. "Through the eastern approach, before sunrise, 4 days ago," she said. "He gave me a written statement. Tom took it to Milford that same morning." "Calloway received a statement from Potts," Colton said, and she could see him putting it together in real time. "He said it was the piece that opened the Harmon connection. Harmon's records showed payments going back 3 years, and 2 of those payments were made before Daly ever came to this ranch, which means the scheme started earlier than we thought." "How much earlier?" she said. 5 years, he said. "Holloway had a private geological survey done 5 years ago. The moment he had those results, he started building the acquisition plan." He looked at her steadily. "Calloway said, without Potts's statement, the Harmon connection might have taken months to uncover. With it, they had it in 2 days. She thought about Potts on his horse in the yard. The heavy, uneven handwriting, the 40 minutes he'd spent getting it down. He did one right thing," she said. "Yes," Colton said. "He did. He came up the porch steps. He looked at her with the full, direct attention that she had come to understand was the way Colton Vance looked at things he considered important, not performing attention, not manufacturing warmth. Simply bringing himself completely present to the thing in front of him. "You held this place," he said. "Tom and Jesse held the place," she said. "I built it," he said. "Yes? Stop," he said, not unkindly. "Just stop deflecting for one moment." She stopped. "You held this place," he said again. "Everything I rode to Helena with, you built. The letter to Calloway, Potts' statement, the wire to Milford, the copy in the outbuilding, the way you responded to Holloway's letter." He paused. "Every piece of this that worked because you were here." She looked at him. She had been told many things about herself over the course of her life. She had been told she was slow, lazy, too large, too much, unwanted, a burden. She had been told she was useful when someone needed her specific skills and irrelevant when they didn't. She had been told, in 100 different ways and voices, that her value was conditional and her welcome was always provisional. She had never been told, plainly and directly and without any visible agenda, that something important had worked because she was present. It landed somewhere deep and stayed there. "There's more," Colton said. She waited. Calloway filed the geological assessment with the Territorial Mineral Rights Registry yesterday morning. It's now on official record the Vance property northeast section, copper-bearing ore deposit of significant reserve value. He paused. 3 mining companies in Helena sent representatives to his office within 6 hours of the filing. She stared at him. 6 hours, she said. Calloway said to tell you that the conservative figure Garrett estimated was almost certainly too conservative, Colton said. Based on what the mining company said when they saw the assessment, the deposit is closer to the upper range. $200,000. She did not say it out loud. But it moved through her like something physical, the full weight of what that number meant for the ranch, for the land Colton had built on grief and stubbornness and 8 years of solitary labor, for the future of this place that had been. 5 weeks ago, in the process of being quietly stolen from under him. "What happens now?" she said when she trusted her voice. "The territorial inquiry into Holloway continues," he said. "Calloway thinks there will be charges filed within the month. The fraud is documented too thoroughly to disappear, and with Harmon's records in the investigators' hands, Holloway's connection to the scheme is direct and evidenced." He paused. "He's retained lawyers. Expensive ones. It will take time. But the property is protected," she said. "The property is protected," he said. "The freeze holds until the investigation concludes. Nobody can touch it." She nodded. She turned and went inside, not because she needed to be away from him, but because she needed a moment with the ordinary objects of the kitchen, the table, the ledgers, the stove, the lamp, to make the transition from what the last weeks had been to what they apparently were about to become. He followed her in. She stood at the table with her hand flat on the surface and looked at the stack of documents she had built, the whole architecture of it, evidence and counter-evidence and formal assessments and witness statements. The entire careful structure of proof that had taken a scheme 5 years in the making and rendered it visible and actionable in 5 weeks. "My father would have liked this," she said to the table. Colton said nothing. He waited. He spent his whole life believing that if you could document something clearly enough, clearly and accurately and completely enough, the truth of it would be undeniable. She paused. He was right about that. He was just wrong about the people he trusted with the documentation. "He trusted you with it," Colton said. She looked up. "He taught me," she said. "That's not the same as trusting me with it." "Isn't it?" Colton said. "He gave you the tools and the belief that the tools were worth having. That's trust." He held her eyes. He trusted the right person. It just took a little longer than he expected to matter. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What did you mean to say? On the porch, the night before you left." "You said you'd say it when you found the words." He was quiet. I found them, he said. On the trail. Had 8 days and a lot of mountain quiet to find them. Then say them, she said. He came to the table and stopped on the other side of it, not close enough to pressure her, not far enough to make this feel like a speech, and he looked at her with the steady, undeflecting directness that was the most fundamental thing about him. I have spent 8 years on this land, telling myself was fine, he said. That I had what I needed, that the work was enough, and the work was enough, and the quiet was enough. He paused. I was wrong about all three, but I was most wrong about the quiet. I thought quiet was peace. It wasn't peace, it was just absence. She listened. You walked into this town with 11 cents and an empty bag and 3 days of hunger behind you, he said. And you sat at my table and read 8 years of problems in one evening, and you told me the truth about every single one of them, without flinching. He paused. I hadn't had anyone tell me the truth in 8 years. I didn't know how much I'd been starving for it until it was right in front of me. The kitchen was very still. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, he said. I want you to know that before I say this. I know that, she said. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs managing. Not because you're useful, though you are more than I knew how to tell you. I want you to stay because this cabin is a different place with you in it, and I have no interest in going back to what it was before. He held her eyes. And because I think and I know I might be wrong, and if I am, you can tell me, and I will hear it, I think you might feel something in the same direction. She looked at him across the table. She thought about the 11 cents. The empty bag. The 3 days of hunger. The morning Gerald Potts had laughed at her in front of 5 people who looked away. She thought about how close she had come to becoming the woman that morning, wanted to make her diminished, quiet, ashamed of the space she occupied in the world. She thought about what it had felt like, that first evening, when Colton Vance had looked at her across a table full of numbers and said you notice things most people miss, not as a compliment designed to get something from her, but as a simple statement of fact from a man who was genuinely uncalculatingly paying attention. She thought about a plate of eggs left beside her bed. She thought about 8 days, and the particular unfamiliar warmth of being someone that another person thought about on a trail. You're not wrong, she said. He came around the table. He stopped in front of her close, real, present in the way he was always present, completely and without pretense, and he took her face in his hands, the weathered, work-ruined hands of a man who had spent 8 years building something alone. And he looked at her the way he had looked at the Frogmorshane, the afternoon they understood what it was worth. With recognition. With the particular, clear-eyed recognition of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for and understands, with complete certainty, what it is. He kissed her. And she let herself be kissed not passively, not gratefully, but with the full and deliberate presence of a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was not enough, and had finally, in this cabin in these mountains with this man, arrived at the simple, unassailable knowledge that she was. When they stepped apart, the kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. Except it wasn't. Some rooms change when the right thing happens in them. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone looking in from the outside, but fundamentally in the way that the purpose of a space shifts when it finally contains the thing it was built for. This was one of those rooms. This was one of those moments. Outside, Tom and Jesse were doing the afternoon work with the focused efficiency of 2 men who had absolutely noticed the boss ride in and were exercising enormous professional discretion about everything that happened after. The ranch moved in its ordinary rhythm, horses in the paddock, the creak of the barn door, the distant sound of the upper pasture carrying on being a pasture. Life, continuing, as it did. 3 weeks later, the territorial sheriff rode out to the ranch with 2 deputies and a document that formalized what Calloway had already told them was coming a full indictment against Vincent Holloway on charges of land fraud, conspiracy, and fraudulent instrument. Robert Harmon had accepted a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony. Miles Daly had been arrested in Billings, found at a boarding house under a different name, which surprised no one who had spent time thinking carefully about the kind of man he was. Gerald Potts lost his business license and paid a fine that took most of what he'd accumulated over the previous 2 years. He also lost whatever standing he'd had in Harlan's Crossing among the people who had believed he was simply a loud, ordinary man rather than a paid instrument of someone else's scheme. What he did with his future after that was his own business. The mining rights negotiation took 4 months. Calloway handled it with the calm precision of a man who had spent a career making sure that people who deserved what they'd built kept it. The final agreement was with a consortium of 3 mining companies, a development arrangement that left the land and the ranch in Colton's ownership and provided a royalty structure that would, over the life of the deposit, exceed even Garrett's upper estimate. Colton told Rosalind the final figure on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, the same table she had first sat at 5 months before with an empty stomach and 8 years of someone else's problems spread out in front of her. She looked at the number. Then she looked at him. "Your father's ranch," he said. She understood immediately. The land that was taken. "Calloway says there may be grounds for a separate action," he said. "Against the estate manager who handled the fraudulent disposition. It was 12 years ago, which complicates it, but he says with the right documentation." "I have documentation," she said. "I know you do," he said. "You have documentation for everything." She looked at the number again. She thought about 12 years, about a young woman who had stood at the edge of everything her family built, and watched it disappear because she hadn't had the resources or the knowledge or the platform to stop it. She was not that woman anymore. She wasn't entirely sure when she had stopped being that woman, exactly. It had not been a single moment. It had been a series of them, the moment she took the food from Colton's hand in front of a store that had just humiliated her. The moment she sat down with the ledgers that first evening and found the truth in them. The moment she pulled a folded note from a supply catalog and understood what it meant. The moment she signed her own name to a letter addressed to the most powerful man in the territory and did not flinch. The moment she let herself be kissed in a kitchen by a man who had spent 8 years building something alone and had finally, without planning it, built something for 2. "Tell Calloway to look at it," she said. Colton looked at her with the quiet, steady warmth that she had come to understand was his version of everything most people needed elaborate language to express. "Already did," he said. She reached across the table. He took her hand. The winter came early that year, in the northern Montana mountains, the way it always did, not asking permission, not offering warning, just arriving one morning as the undeniable fact of the next several months. The ranch prepared the way ranches always prepared, with a particular focused industry of people who understood that the season rewarded those who took it seriously. Rosalind put up the winter stores with a system so well organized that even Jesse, who had grown up doing this work, admitted it was better than anything he'd seen. Tom reinforced the barn against the wind with the same careful competence he brought to everything. Colton rode the fence lines one last time and came back satisfied, which was not a state he arrived at easily or performed. On the evening of the first real snow, they sat on the covered porch, all 4 of them. Because by then the lines between employer and employee and household had softened into something more honest and more useful, and watched the white come down over the mountains in the particular silence of a first snowfall. At some point Jesse said quietly, "You think Holloway's lawyers are going to get him out of it?" "No," Rosalind said. "How can you be sure?" he said. She looked at the snow. "Because the documentation is complete," she said. And complete documentation doesn't have gaps for lawyers to work in. Tom made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Tom generally got. The snow fell. The mountains held. The woman who had arrived in this territory with 11 cents, an empty bag, and the accumulated weight of every person who had ever looked at her and decided she was not worth the trouble, that woman had built something here. Not just the case that saved the ranch, not just the system that kept it running. Not just the evidence that brought a 5-year scheme to its reckoning. She had built a life, out of numbers and ledgers and the careful documentation of truth. Out of two people's willingness to look at each other clearly, without the distortions of what the world had told them they were supposed to see. Out of the particular, hard-won knowledge that your value is not determined by the people who were too careless to see it. Colton's hand found hers in the porch dark, and she held it without looking at him, watching the snow cover the mountains in the deep, indifferent, beautiful white of a Montana winter. She had come here with nothing. She had been wrong about that. She had come here with everything that mattered: her mind, her skill, her undefeated insistence on being seen accurately, rather than conveniently, and she had simply needed to find this place of the person that recognized what she was carrying. She had found them both. And the mountain ranch that had almost been stolen, in the Montana winter of 1884, stood exactly where it had always stood: solid, permanent, built by two survivors who had found in each other the one thing that made everything else worth having. The certain, unshakable knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged.